Welcome to Shannon Marie Photography, where we specialize in turning memories into keepsakes. Based in Southwest Wisconsin, we offer a range of photography services, including weddings, senior portraits, and capturing precious moments with newborns and families. Our portfolio is a testament to the beauty and joy we've had the privilege to capture. Whether it's a bride and groom at sunset, a little boy with a big smile, or a newborn in a basket, we ensure each image is a treasure. Book your session today at shannonmariephoto.com.
This is a Queen Bee Radio High School sports presentation.
Hey, we're back. It's another edition of the High School Sports Roundup on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel and SoundCloud channel as well. Tyler DeCandis and Steve Prestegard with you as we start talking about the spring sports season after a month away from our last episode talking about Mineral Point going to state in boys basketball. And now that Mother Nature has decided to cooperate and give us some opportunity to have games to talk about, we're back and ready to chat. And we're going to start off with some softball as we get ready to bring you some high school softball coming up next week on our Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. A big game in the Six Rivers West between Highland and Belmont. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Steve, before we go into the games that have happened, we didn't really get to preview what softball and baseball would potentially bring us this season. But before the season began, what were some of the things that you were kind of having your eye on and things that might have caught your attention in the early part of the season?
Well, first, the obvious question is how many games are you going to get to play with weather? You know, the issue becomes obviously with baseball and softball that thanks to what passes for spring in this state, that there are some years where you just, you try to play games and can't, and then having to jam games into, the last few weeks of the season. It's not been particularly bad this year, but it's not been particularly good. It's been kind of average, I think, as far as, games that have been wiped out due to the usual weather issues. The thing that kind of hurts, I guess, in a sense, is that there are very few or maybe no artificial turf baseball fields around. Of course, part of that is because it's not something that can be, where the turf is necessarily all that helpful, because unlike in football, for instance, where you're going to play in practically any weather, a turf field would, do a good job of drying out. But the problem is the weather around it can still be bad. As we're recording this on Wednesday, it's kind of raw out, spitting rain, windy, and it would probably be borderline for games in weather like this, and we've had worse than weather like this. So, as far as that part of it goes, I don't know that there's been a particular surprise. You can look as far as, softball goes. In the SWAL, for instance, it seemed as though everybody was picking Fenimore as the team, to beat, or actually that'd be in baseball, they were picking Fenimore as the team to beat. At this point in things, the teams that are really the two teams that are standing out, at least starting the week, Prairie du Chien and Mineral Point haven't lost a game yet. Basketball and the SWAL, well, as long as they have Greta Grassel, they have a shot of winning against anybody, you would certainly think. Belmont is a team that had almost everybody back except their pitchers. And the one thing that Jeff Hodgson was concerned about was having pitchers that had not really pitched very much in the varsity, at the varsity level. But, they got so much else back that I think it was pretty obvious that Belmont came in as the favorite of the Six Rivers West. And certainly in the Six Rivers West, there's not any question that Belmont has the most established program, trips to state, trips deep in the postseason, and so on.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of stood out to me in the early part of the season is, when the first rankings came out for softball and, looking even at the rankings that just came out on Tuesday, how much respect Southwest Wisconsin is getting as far as potential contenders to go to state. Now, keep in mind, the last time a softball team locally went to state, you and I were there in Green Bay in sopping wet thunderstorm weather, where we got back to the Platteville area somewhere between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning.
2:30.
Yep. The first, or I shouldn't say the first, but the COVID era softball that was going on when they had the site split up, and you couldn't play games in Dane County because of COVID protocol, so they played at UW Green Bay. But Dodgeville, the last team locally to go to state in 2021, and when you look at the latest rankings, in Division III, Prairie du Chien, as you said, they're 7-0. One of the undefeated teams in the area, and then in Division IV, Basketball and Mineral Point showing up in the top 10 rankings, and then there's 4 teams locally in Division V. When you have Belmont, Highland, Wazeeka-Steuben, and Barneveld all in the mix, and a lot of those teams are going to be seeing each other. Of course, as we mentioned, coming up on Tuesday, we will have on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel Highland at Belmont in what will be an outstanding matchup. But just the fact that we have so many teams locally that are, well respected and are, legitimate contenders, I suspect that this year, we might see a situation that we saw in girls basketball during the winter, where we might send 2 teams locally, one in Division IV, one in Division V. I could certainly see that happening.
Yeah, definitely. And if you extend quote our area to Prairie du Chien, that could be 3 actually.
Yeah.
Of course, the issue, is you're not going to see Basketball and Mineral Point get to stay, because they're going to crash into each other at some point in the postseason. I say that without seeing what the brackets look like, but I'm pretty positive that's the case in Division IV. Belmont and Highland have gone after each other well before this, so that pair of teams is probably the 2 most established teams in the Six Rivers West, and that's been the case for several years. So, that part of it is probably not that much of a surprise either. One thing about Dodgeville, when they won state in 2021, and maybe the case also this year, when you have teams that are as good as this, Dodgeville did not win their conference in 2021. River Valley did, but I remember going up to River Valley for the regional final, and the home team didn't win that game. And then, from that point on, Dodgeville didn't lose the rest of the season, including our doubleheader up at UW Green Bay. So that is the sort of thing you could certainly see happening this year. And in fact, that happened to Mineral Point, and I forget which year it was, but it was actually one of those years where they were, they won the conference, but didn't end up winning. In fact, they got beat by Iowa Grant, if I'm not mistaken, in the postseason.
Yep.
There's a reason that the phrase "it's tough to beat a team 3 times in a season" exists, and it's because there have been numerous examples of exactly that happening over the years. And when you have teams that are pretty good, pretty comparable to each other, and very quality teams, this could be the case where, whoever ends up winning the conference doesn't get very far in the postseason because they ran into somebody just below them who is good also, and maybe had a couple of bad games in the regular season and make up for it in the postseason.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's not necessarily who you play, but when you play them as well. Some teams tend to get hotter as the season goes along. And, we talked about the SWAL, and, you and I were kind of chatting about this before we started recording, that this conference, on paper is shaping out to be one of the craziest conferences, because, you have Basketball, Mineral Point, who are ranked. Mineral Point still undefeated. Basketball's only loss was a 1-2 loss to Wazeeka-Steuben, who is ranked in Division V. Basketball has not played Cuba City, Mineral Point, or Fenimore yet. I believe their wins were against Riverdale, Southwestern, and I believe Iowa Grant were the 3 conference wins that they have so far to this point. We've joked, in our other high school sports roundup episodes about being truthers of certain teams. I'm gonna jump on board and say that I am a basketball truther, and if not necessarily a basketball truther, but a Greta Grassel truther, because you don't win Conference Player of the Year 3 times in a row by accident. You don't have the accolades that she does. You don't get the Division I scholarship where she's going to be playing at Mississippi State once her career is done. So far, basketball only allowing 6 runs combined through the first 6 games of their season. This is a team that has gone deep in the postseason. They were a game, not just a game, but half an inning away from going to state 2 seasons ago. This is the last chance for, a Greta Grassel-led basketball team to, punch their ticket to state. And things on paper at least seem to be shaping out that way. She co-authored a no-hitter along with Aaron Knowles against DeSoto earlier, and then also threw a no-hitter against Darlington. So she's in prime form. She is this might be her best version of herself, as a senior for this basketball Bulldogs team. And I think at this point in the season, they're setting the pace in the SWAL, but there's a lot of strong contenders in the SWAL that are going to try and knock them out.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that's going to make it's a question mark perhaps for basketball is what kind of offense they can get. If you have Greta Grassel going for you, you got a shot. But on the other hand, sometimes it's just kind of weird how it works. If the bats aren't doing well,
right,
then that puts the pressure on your pitcher. And it also puts the pressure on your defense because, somebody obviously can have a great ERA, but ends up giving more runs because of questionable defense. And so the pressure's kind of on the players behind Greta Gressel in that sense, and also in the batting lineup to make sure that they get some runs for her, because a 1-0 loss is a loss,
Mm-hmm.
And that I think the game that you're talking about with the sectional final loss, that was not a very high scoring game if I remember right, and they were literally, it was kind of like death by 1,000 cuts for basketball because they kind of got picked at thanks to bunting until they ended up losing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly that. And, for what it's worth, Greta Grassel can be an offensive threat as well. She's hit, multiple home runs, and I believe that she was around a 500 hitter, if not better, last year as well. And then she's been hitting in the number 3 spot from what I can tell from most of the games so far this season. So she's an offensive threat in itself. But again, it's, what the supporting cast can do to help out. But she's in prime form, and things in the SWAL seem to start taking shape. We will have a couple basketball games on our high school Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel coming up later on in the season. We'll give you scheduling updates, assuming that everything goes the way that we expect to, because Mother Nature's a factor in all of this as well. But yeah, the SWAL is definitely a conference to keep an eye on. And the team that we really haven't talked all that much is Cuba City, because by the way, they were a game away from going to state last year as well. So I mean, there's 5 teams in the SWAL that are all vying for the top, and if they're all beating up on each other, that's going to make for a very fun conference to follow during the regular season, and we'll keep tabs on that as the season goes along. Let's go to the Six Rivers West. As you alluded to, Steve, it's pretty much a 2-horse race between Belmont and Highland. Those are 2 programs that have gone head-to-head numerous times over the last couple of years with some high stakes. Not just in softball, but also in girls basketball and in volleyball. These girls know each other. I'm pretty sure that the seniors are probably sick of seeing each other, but they might welcome the competition that comes along with it. For the Six Rivers West, you do have, teams like, River Ridge that are still young. I believe they have 2 freshman pitchers that, that are playing, somewhat well. They took it to Highland. It was a 2-0 win in favor of Highland earlier this year. I believe it might have even been last week as well. But really, it's Belmont and Highland who's at the top. And, I think it's just, can one of those teams win head-to-head twice to win the conference? And in what would most likely happen, they're going to run into each other at some point in the postseason. What does that third matchup look like?
Yeah, definitely. And again, in Belmont's case, as I said, Jeff Hodgson's biggest concern seemed to be pitching experience. that's a program. And one of the things he said that is a very interesting point is they've got legacy players. In other words, Haji's been around so long that he has the daughters of players that he used to coach who are now playing for him. I just find that amusing, but they need to get the pitching just needs experience, and obviously so far it's worked out quite well for them. But that is the sort of thing that that I think they need to get is just more innings under their belt and understanding which varsity players in any sport figure out that everybody is faster at that level and more fundamentally sound at that level, and can execute whether it's a hit and run or bunt or whatever at that level, make defensive plays and all that. They just have to learn that. But certainly the way things are going right now for the Braves, things are going. I have to think that he's pretty happy about how things are going. Similarly with Highland as well. And that game next Tuesday, we're certainly looking forward to that for that reason.
Yep, absolutely. That matchup on Tuesday we'll have right here on the Queen Radio Sports YouTube channel. Pregame around 4:40 and the first pitch set for 5 o'clock. Let's move into the SWC, where the standings in the SWC, I think, Steve, are pretty interesting because, as we said, Prairie du Chien undefeated on the season so far. They are at 7-0, but in that second place spot, the Lancaster Flying Arrows 5-1 on the season. Looking at their schedule, their only loss was to Prairie du Chien. I believe 10-8 was the final in that matchup, but the Arrows off to a nice start. Platteville in the middle of the pack with a 1-1 conference record, 2-5 overall. Early look at the SWC. What stands out to you about that conference?
Well, obviously, at this point, it looks like Prairie, is doing well. But Lancaster has had a good year as well. The one that's a hair surprising to me, I guess, is Dodgeville. Mm-hmm. Although, if you look at their, they're 0-2. Maybe they played, difficult teams at the start. Their overall record isn't too bad at 3-4. That obviously is a very experienced program. Well, they won a state title a couple of years ago for obvious reasons, but right. It's possible, I suppose, that they're in a little bit of a rebuilding dip at this point. But certainly Prairie and Lancaster, that's going to be interesting to watch, particularly the second matchup when they have those two teams have to play a second time.
Yeah, we'll keep tabs on the SWC as well. But again, Prairie du Chien off to a nice start, undefeated to begin the season. The Arrows having a nice start to their season as well. Looking at the Six Rivers East, not a whole lot as far as, impressive records. Everyone is kind of under 500 at this point. Barneveld at the top of the conference with Judah Albany with 1-0 conference records, but overall Barneveld 2-3 and Judah Albany 3-2. But if I believe what I saw is correct, I believe Barneveld played a couple teams that were out of state in a number of tournaments. Just trying to pull up their schedule here. But Barneveld is one of the ranked teams in Division 5, so you would anticipate that that they're going to be a top contender. They played teams from Alabama. This thing keeps turning on me. So, their losses were to Springville, Alabama, Vestavia Hills, Alabama, and Harstell, Alabama. They played in the Gulf Coast Classic tournament and then had a 7-7 tie with Pleasant Valley, Alabama. And then since coming back to the Wisconsin side, a 4-0 win against Potosi Cassville and a 3-0 win against Monticello New Glarus. So against teams from Wisconsin, they're doing fairly well, but you would anticipate, for a team that has been in the sectional round fairly recently, I believe not this last year, but the year before, they were in the sectional final after they defeated Belmont in the sectional semifinal with an opportunity to go to state. So Barneveld very much in the mix in the Six Rivers East. And then our friends in the Ridge and Valley, Wazeeka Steuben in the Division 5 WizSports.net poll as well. Had a nice start to their season. They are the only team to hand a loss to basketball. So they've had a nice start to their season. Don't see a lot of stats or information about who's doing what, so we can't give credit to the players behind that. But I will say it is kind of nice seeing Wazeeka Steuben showing up in the rankings after, the girls had a very successful basketball season. I'm sure most of those girls, just given how small the school district is, playing a role in the softball side of things as well.
Yeah, that's not surprising when you have good girls basketball teams. I think that probably applies to Barnwell as well. They had a pretty good season. It seems like so March ago, but that when teams have pretty good girls basketball seasons, that it often translates into softball as well. Interestingly, not necessarily the same players, but the same group. The same group of players, and so that will make the postseason quite interesting, obviously, especially if, maybe at some point there will be a basketball Wazeeka Steuben rematch somewhere deep in the postseason, depending on who goes in which direction. But as far as Barneveld taking a trip to play, that's one way to solve the weather problem. Remember that just around Easter, actually, the Platteville baseball team went to Indiana and played 3 games. And so I believe, at least at this point, they have more games played in baseball, Platteville does, than anybody else. And that was specifically the reason was, the farther south you go, the more likely you are able to play games. And obviously Barneveld figured that out, and obviously Platteville has as well.
Yep, and what's going to be interesting is these non-conference matchups that teams like Barneveld and Wazeeka Steuben will play against some of the more local teams from the SWAL and the Six Rivers West that that we follow. Barneveld's going to be playing Highland, and they will also be playing at Belmont later on this season. Wazeeka Steuben also has matchups against Fenimore, so it'll be very interesting to see, where these non-conference matchups and then interdivisional matchups, how they play out, because that could be a primer for teams being able to play each other or get themselves ready to play some big games in the postseason down the line.
Definitely. That's what makes it fun to have those non-conference games, because that, it's like, oh yeah, they played back in, early April or something like that. And then when the weather's much nicer, or a chance of being much nicer, then it's for all the marbles, so to speak.
Yeah, but it should be a very fun regular season for softball. Again, our game of the week coming up on Tuesday, we will have Highland at Belmont, a big matchup in the Six Rivers West. We'll have that game right here on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel coming up on Tuesday, pregame at 4:40, first pitch at 5 o'clock. That wraps up our softball coverage for this week, but coming up next, we'll get you the Subs.com highlight reel and our baseball chats, talking about the local baseball teams that are competing, because, again, the weather's decided to cooperate. We have some games that we can talk about. So we'll talk about baseball coming up on the High School Sports Roundup on YouTube and SoundCloud.
Check out Subs.com. Subs is Southwest Wisconsin's go-to supplement store. Find all your favorite supplement brands at the best prices from local people. Fuel your fitness journey. Subs.com, your go-to supplement store with locations in Fenimore and Dubuque.
This week's highlight reel is presented by Subs.com.
looking for a checking account with no monthly requirements or service charge? People's State Bank's People's Checking Account is just what you're looking for. This account includes free debit card, online and mobile banking, bill pay, and much more at no cost to you. You heard that right. No cost to you. We're your local community bank ready to serve you. People's State Bank. Member FDIC.
Now it's time to chat about baseball on the high school sports roundup. I'm rejoined by Steve Prestigard. And Steve, same thing that we did with softball, some initial preseason thoughts, things that we were looking for heading into the season. I will say one of the things that I kind of had my eye on was the number of contenders that we have that could potentially make a deep postseason run. We've been pretty fortunate over the last few years that we've sent a team locally to state. Of course, last year, Pecatonica played for the state title in Division 4. The year before that, Cuba City won the state title in Division 3. The year before that, Southwestern went to state in Division 4. So we've had a number of teams go to state. We've had Cuba City bring home some hardware, but this year, it's very interesting because a lot of the pitching from our top contenders, a lot of those top pitchers have graduated. So there's some holes in a lot of these pitching rotations for these teams that need to be addressed. And that's going to be a driving factor, I think, for how this season is going to play out for all the teams across the board.
That is a huge factor. And the obvious reason is, in the pitch count world, it used to be before that you could literally win a state championship, and teams have, with 2 pitchers. But you can't do that anymore because it's rare anymore that a pitcher is able to get through a game. One pitcher is able to get through a game. And we saw that with Cuba City winning state, that they literally needed 3 pitchers to win the state championship and to win every level, regional level and then the sectional, then obviously up at state. So the first question you ask with any team is, what's your pitching depth like? And that is the question that I guess you go into every season, basically asking.
Yep, exactly. And one of the things that really stands out, especially during the Cuba City title run 2 seasons ago, was you were there when the postseason began. It was a 1-0 win for Cuba City over Fenimore that kind of sent them, on this run. So the margin of error is so slim, and you need to have, not just the 2 pitchers, but you also need that third, because if you're in these competitive games, you only have 100 pitches to work with. And, if you have to go extra innings, that's more pitching that you have to use. You have to, go deep, down the rotation. And, especially with the Swallows, same thing with softball. I mean, this conference is, going to be one of the ones to watch, if not the conference to be watching, because, of course, Cuba City went deep in the postseason last year. They made it to the sectional final before losing out. One of the wins that Cuba City had in the sectional round was against Dodgeville in the sectional semifinal. And then last year, Cuba City was co-champions of the conference with Fenimore. Fenimore lost to Mineral Point in the regional semifinal last year. Coach Brent Scheckler has said that this is one of his best teams, if not the best teams that he's coached in his 19-year tenure with Fenimore. Darlington off to a nice start this year. Mineral Point 5-1. I believe their only loss was to Onalaska in a tournament over this past weekend. So the SWAL, I think all hands on deck, and it could be just which pitchers match up when, and are teams playing on back-to-back days, how that impacts things. I don't know if you can accurately gauge how any postseason success is going to be based on the regular season, because if games keep getting moved and postponed and stuff like that, it's hard to tell what the matchups are really going to be looking like.
Well, let's go back to that story that you were talking about, the postseason when Cuba City won state. They won their first playoff game, as you pointed out, over Fenimore 1-0 on an unearned. It wasn't an unearned run, but it was a balk. They ended up driving in the only run of the game without a hit or a walk or anything, kind of like that. Now, conversely, at the exact same time, Mineral Point and Fenimore were playing this, or not Fenimore, Mineral Point was playing this slugfest because their field faces differently from Cuba City. It was a very windy day. Wind was blowing out in Mineral Point. It was blowing in Cuba City. So it was a taut game in Cuba City, and it was just a slugfest in Mineral Point. They needed 3 pitchers to get through that game. The next day, they're playing Cuba City, and they discovered that their pitching depth wasn't as good as they needed it to be. So that's your evidence right there about pitching depth. And what's interesting about Mineral Point specifically is that after their incredibly long state run, which ended correctly, of course, you would think that they would have been kind of wiped out by that, and yet here they are. They came into the week undefeated in the conference and just the one loss, as you pointed out. So it's like the baseball players that picked up where the basketball players have left off. Fenimore is, their work was a little slower start, I guess, but again, it's as the phrase goes. Well, actually, I'm not going to use that phrase. I was going to say it's a marathon, not a sprint, except it's really not either, because it's a marathon that's kind of jammed into, a short amount of time, especially with weather.
Right. Yeah.
Whatever that means.
Yeah. It makes sense, when you kind of see how things are shaping out, and the thing that I look at with the SWAL, I think of teams like Mineral Point, where, like you said, Mineral Point coming off the, state championship for basketball. A number of those players are, key role players, on this baseball team. And you would think that momentum does, carry over, you're riding that high, and you want to continue chasing that. And it certainly seems to be something that has helped them to at least begin in the early part of the season. But the other thing that we got to factor in is injuries. Are there are the pitchers going to be consistently healthy? If you have a more compressed schedule, you have the 100 pitch count, and I believe you have to rest a certain number of days before you can pitch again. But even when you get that adequate rest, or at least the rest based on the WIA and NFHS protocols, are you still going to be healthy enough to have enough gas once we get to the postseason? And are you going to be worn down? You would think that if these athletes have been competing all year long across multiple sports, that they're used to it and things like that. But does that fatigue wear in? And depending on who the matchup is, if you're seeing a team, for the third time, have they figured you out? Do they figure out your tendencies and things like that? It's going to be very interesting. And I think the SWAL, is going to be kind of the wild, wild west in a lot of ways, just based on, scheduling and how these teams are going to be matching up against each other and when they play each other during the season.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of Darwinist, kind of survival of the fittest. I think whoever comes out, because there are obviously quite established programs. Fenimore has been good, and as you pointed out, they seem to have the best team, at least their coach thinks. Mineral Points, well, they had back-to-back trips to state a few years ago. Cuba City won it a couple of years ago. Just that's how things have panned out to this point. And that's still not, considering a few outliers. Iowa Grand got off to a good start in baseball this year. Mm-hmm. So, it's still early enough, I think, to be still pretty unpredictable how things are going to pan out.
Yep, agreed. We'll see how the SWAL looks. We do have a couple SWAL games on our Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel that we'll get to down later on in the season. But let's switch from the SWAL to the SWC, where Platteville is at the top of the conference, 4-3 overall, 1-0 in conference play. River Valley also 1-0 in conference play with a 2-3 overall record. Prairie du Chien 1-1, 3-1 overall. I kind of figured heading into the season that this would be Prairie du Chien's conference to kind of be the lead horse in that race. They've had some success over the at least last year. They lost to Cuba City in the, I believe, regional final. Played at Prairie du Chien last year, but looking at the standings right now and kind of reading some of the previews, there's some hype around this Platteville Hillman squad this year, Steve.
Well, they have basically everybody back, so yes, there is. And if the quote from Randy Knight, the Platteville coach, was his biggest chore is going to be figuring out correct lineups. And I gathered from reading that he didn't mean, well, we got 9 spots we have to fill, but more like making sure that the right guys are in the right position. And because he's got a lot to choose from. And, Platteville's not been great the last few years, or maybe even longer than that, but maybe maybe this is a target of opportunity season for them at this point. One thing to keep in mind, that is a group that won the conference in football, won the conference in basketball, and got all the way to the sectional final in basketball. So, they're good athletes. And I know that coaches of other sports really do firmly believe that postseason experience does translate from one sport to another. Sometimes you kind of question that, but they really do believe that because they know what pressure is like. They understand that. They know that they'll be playing in possibly adverse conditions when you're playing at in a arena or in a baseball field that's not a friendly place, or the weather is bad, or something like that. You're playing like your 5th game in 4 days or something like that, and you have to get through that. And that's what the postseason experience gets you. And maybe Platteville's running on that to some extent at this point.
Yeah, it'll be fun to see this Platteville team, and I do think that like you said, I think that success in other sports does translate, and I've talked about this with Tom Nices, who of course Hall of Fame basketball coach, coached at River Ridge, and he saw the success of River Ridge football winning the conference title a couple seasons ago, how that helped them. With their basketball conference titles that they had during his tenure. And I think a lot of coaches, you hear that from, coaches in this area that coach multiple sports, how much, success leads to success in all aspects, not just the individual sport that you achieve those accomplishments in. And it certainly seems to be the case for Platteville, at least in the early part of the season. And I'm very curious to see how Platteville and Prairie du Chien match up as the season goes along, because I think the Blackhawks are certainly poised to have some success this year as well. Let's look at the Six Rivers West, where similar to softball, I think it's Belmont and Highland going to be at the top of the conference this year. Early part of the season, Belmont 5-1 overall, 2-0 in the Six Rivers West conference play wise. Highland is at 3-1 overall. They're 1-0 in conference play. And then Potosi, Cassville, Shullsburg, Benton, and River Ridge, all under 500 to begin the season. But I know for sure with River Ridge, they're a younger team. I believe they bring back mostly everyone. I think it was only one senior that graduated from last year's team. So they're still very young, but Belmont and Highland, they're experienced. We know that especially for Highland coming off basketball, seeing firsthand how athletic that team is, I certainly see why that they're a top contender, but it almost feels like a copy paste between baseball and softball in the Six Rivers West. It's Belmont and Highland, and just when do they match up and how well do they play against each other? That's going to determine the conference.
Well, there's another parallel, and I find this is a really funny parallel. Last week, Belmont went to Shullsburg Benton and pitched a no-hitter in baseball. At the same time, Belmont went to Benton Shullsburg and pitched a no-hitter in softball. And I'm not sure I've heard of that happening. I'm sure it has, but meet the same co-op schools in the same sport during the same week with a no-hitter in each case is that's pretty that's one of those, hey, how often does that happen? So Belmont, I think, is they've got a very established program. They don't always have great years just because of that's how graduation takes place. But let's remember that Belmont got to state and surprised everybody by getting there, a few years back. And basically, when we were talking about pitching depth, they managed to take advantage of Bangor's lack of pitching depth in the sectional final that Mark Evenstad and I did when it was about 1,000 degrees at Riverdale. And it was, you had literally pitchers for Bangor who could not find the strike zone. And Shark and I were kind of like, what, just because Bangor had won the first game pretty handily, but the problem was that was their best pitcher by far, one of the Horseman brothers. And when they had to bring the other guys out, they didn't do so well, and Belmont just sat there and made them throw strikes, and they failed to throw strikes, and they took the free passes, and Belmont ended up winning the sectional final to go to state on a 10-run rule game, which is pretty rare also if you think about it. Mm-hmm. So Belmont's quite an established program, off to a good start this year. Highland is also, as you pointed out, they've done well this year also, and it's still really early, but you can tell at least a few things, that the Six Rivers West looks like a top-heavy conference in baseball.
If that seems to be the case in the early part of the season, we'll keep tabs on how the conference plays out, and we'll be interested to see how the matchups between Highland and Belmont play out. Let's move into the Six Rivers East, where again, if we're going to pick to be a truther of a certain team, the team that I am going to pick is Pecatonica, solely because you go to state last year, you have a 7-run lead, 5 innings in the state championship game before Ithaca goes on this big run to score 8 unanswered and walk it off in the state championship. And you return everybody except for one player, Coy Rudseger, who graduated. He was the third baseman and the third pitcher for the Vikings last year. They're off to a solid start, 3-1 overall. They have wins against River Ridge. It was a doubleheader this past Friday, 8-2 and 10-3, and then a win on Monday against Barneveld, 7-2. Their only loss was at the very beginning of the season, a 3-0 loss to Mineral Point, who, again, very hot start for the Pointers in the first baseball game after winning a state championship in basketball. So, again, riding that high. However, Mother Nature robbed us of some really awesome potential matchups that Pecatonica could have had, including a matchup at Cuba City, which I don't know if that game's been rescheduled, but if that is one that's going to happen, that's a very intriguing matchup. And then another non-conference matchup with River Valley. I thought that would have been a really cool test to kind of see where the Vikings are at. But, again, Jim Strumman, has been coaching 40 plus years, it was really cool to see him go to state last year. The Pecatonica community definitely showed out for them. And, there aren't any baseball rankings out right now, but I would have to expect if Pecatonica isn't one of the top teams, I'd be very shocked, if they aren't. At the top, but I certainly think that that's a team that's probably the most poised to have a deep postseason run of the teams in our area.
Well, yeah, if your number 3 pitcher is the only graduate and you lose one position player in that person, and that team has to remember how state ended last year for them. Mm-hmm. Again, pitching depth, as we said, is the sort of thing that either gets you going someplace or hurts you. But they are experienced, and I have to think that they are also motivated. So, yeah, I have to think if Peck's not ranked highly, you have to ask who's doing the picking. Certainly.
Right. Yep, exactly. And then, looking at the Ridge and Valley, again, Ithaca, the reigning state champion, the team that beat Pecatonica at state. They begin the season 4-0, 3-0 in conference play. Also, nice start to their season. Seneca 4-0 on the season, 3-0 in conference play. And I was looking at the scores for Seneca in particular when I was putting together the the scores from the last week, and they have had some pretty pretty impressive final scores from what I could tell. A 6-0 win against River Ridge, a 17-1 win against Lafarge, a 7-0 win against DeSoto, and 7-3 against North Crawford. So only allowing 4 runs over 4 games. That's pretty darn impressive, including 2 shutout wins. But again, you have yet to see Ithaca, and it's probably shaping out that those are the 2 teams probably at the very top of the conference to decide how that's going to play out.
Yeah, and of course, again, there's you assume that those 2 teams are probably going to meet somewhere in the postseason. Also, and again, I don't have the brackets in front of me, but I would guess that Peck will be going one direction, and Ithaca will be going a different direction if that's how it all pans out in the end.
Yep, it's going to be a very fun regular season for baseball, and I'm very curious to see how many of these non-conference matchups still do happen. Again, we were robbed of some very fun non-conference matchups, but nature, decided to do her thing, and if those games don't get rescheduled, hopefully that leads to some fun matchups in the postseason down the line. We should mention that our first baseball broadcast on our Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel will be Fenimore at Cuba City a week from Friday. So we'll have that game on the 26th. Steve, you and I will be on the call of that one. And again, 2 programs that know each other quite well. We talked about, how a 1-0 Cuba City win in a believe was that regional quarter or regional semifinal that led to Cuba City ultimately winning a state title. But again, Fenimore, very optimistic and very high about their team, and of course, Coach Steve Graber always going to have his Cubans coached up, ready to go. And one of the key dominoes or key puzzle pieces in the SWAL picture going to be playing out a week from Friday.
Oh yes, and we're definitely looking forward to that. And again, the first of at least 2, but possibly more than that matchups. Cuba City at this point, they now have it in their culture that they're going to make a pretty good sized postseason run, state championship and sectional final in back-to-back years. And obviously, they have to replace the players who graduate who are such great players on those teams, but they'll be there by the end of the season. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing how that game plays out, as well as all the other games that we have, not just on our YouTube channel, but throughout the rest of the regular season as well. And that will wrap up our high school baseball chat for this week on the High School Sports Roundup. And that wraps up this week's episode as well. Thanks, Steve, for joining me, and we'll see you for another episode of the High School Sports Roundup next week.